August 1944. The road between Falaise and Troon, Normandy, a stretch of narrow country lanes that survivors on both sides will later call simply the Corridor of Death. Below, a mass of German vehicles, tanks, half-tracks, horse-drawn artillery, staff cars, and columns of infantry on foot, chokes the road for miles, the shattered remnant of two German armies trying to escape a closing Allied encirclement. Above, American P-47 Thunderbolts and British Typhoons circle in relentless rotation, diving one after another onto the packed column below, cannon and rocket fire tearing into vehicles that have nowhere to disperse, no cover to reach, and no way to outrun aircraft that can cross the length of the traffic jam in seconds. Wrecked tanks and burning trucks block the road further with every pass, turning the retreat into a stationary target gallery that Allied pilots return to strike again and again through the daylight hours. Surviving German officers later describe entire stretches of road where movement becomes physically impossible, not because of enemy ground fire, but because the wreckage of previous vehicles, still burning, blocks every lane, forcing men to abandon transport entirely and continue on foot through fields already cratered by earlier strikes. By the time the gap finally closes days later, the road and the fields beside it are littered with the wreckage of thousands of vehicles and the bodies of men and horses that Allied ground crews clearing the area afterward describe as one of the most complete scenes of destruction any of them encounter in the entire war. Scenes like this one, repeated across France through the summer of 1944, do more than destroy equipment. They force an entire army to relearn, in a matter of weeks, how to move at all. The popular version of this story places one of Germany's most celebrated operational commanders at the center of that lesson. Erich von Manstein, architect of some of the most audacious mobile campaigns of the war, personally reacting to the American P-47's impact on German movement and issuing new orders to his own columns in response. The documented record shows something different about where Manstein actually is when the P-47 earns this reputation, and what that gap reveals is more interesting than the legend. Manstein is not in France in the summer of 1944. He has not commanded troops anywhere near the P-47's most devastating operations, and by the time the Corridor of Death closes in the third week of August, he has not held any active military command at all for nearly 5 months. Hitler relieves Manstein of command on March 30, 1944, following a long-running dispute over strategy on the Eastern Front, the theater where Manstein has spent virtually the entire war, and which he will never leave for a Western assignment before his career in active command ends entirely. The judgment attributed to him about the P-47 changing how German columns move is not a wartime field order or a contemporaneous staff assessment. It is, like so much of what senior German commanders eventually say about the war's final year, a reflection offered afterward in Manstein's post-war memoir Lost Victories, published in the 1950s, drawing on reports, testimony, and the broader post-war historical record rather than personal experience of the aircraft or the campaign he is describing. The insight is real. The vantage point from which it is delivered is not what the popular framing implies. To understand why Manstein's post-war judgment on this subject carries real weight despite his absence from the battlefield it describes, the story has to begin with the doctrine that made him, by most assessments on both sides of the war, the most operationally gifted commander Germany produced. Manstein's reputation is built first on a plan rather than a battle. The operational concept for the 1940 invasion of France, developed while he serves as Chief of Staff to Army Group A, that proposes striking through the supposedly impassable Ardennes forest, rather than repeating the more predictable northern thrust through Belgium that Allied planners expect and are prepared to counter. The original German plan, closely resembling the Schlieffen concept from the First World War, strikes Manstein as dangerously predictable, and he spends the winter of 1939 into 1940 pressing his case through official channels, and, when that fails to gain traction, through increasingly direct appeals that eventually irritate his superiors enough that he is transferred away from the planning staff entirely, a reassignment that, by chance, places him in a position to present his ideas personally to Hitler during a courtesy visit before taking up his new post, a a conversation that proves decisive in getting the plan adopted over the objections of much of the German general staff. The plan, adopted only after Manstein's persistent advocacy overcomes considerable resistance within the German High Command, produces the armored breakthrough at Sedan that Guderian's panzer divisions exploit to reach the English Channel in days, ending organized French resistance faster than any commander on either side believed possible. It establishes Manstein's reputation for the kind of bold, imaginative operational thinking that distinguishes him from more conventional staff officers of his generation, even though Manstein himself, sidelined from the planning staff by the time the invasion actually begins, commands only an infantry corps during the campaign whose central concept he had authored. That reputation deepens through Manstein's commands on the Eastern Front, where he leads the difficult and ultimately successful siege of Sevastopol in 1941 and 1942, a fortress the Soviet Union has spent years reinforcing, and that falls only after months of siege warfare, employing some of the largest artillery pieces ever built by German industry, including the massive Dora railway gun, a campaign that earns Manstein promotion to Field Marshal and where his most celebrated achievement, the counterstroke that becomes known as the Third Battle of Kharkov in February and March 1943, demonstrates the doctrine he becomes most associated with for the remainder of the war. What he later calls the backhand blow, a deliberate willingness to yield ground under pressure, drawing an overextended attacker forward before striking its flank with concentrated mobile reserves once it has outrun its own supporting fire and logistics. Executed in the chaotic aftermath of the German defeat at Stalingrad, when Soviet forces are advancing rapidly and German command in southern Russia appears close to complete collapse, with some Soviet spearheads advancing over 100 miles in a matter of weeks and threatening to cut off German forces still fighting in the Donetsk region entirely, Manstein's counterstroke inflicts a sharp reversal on overextended Soviet spearheads, retakes Kharkov, and stabilizes a front that had seemed, only weeks earlier, on the verge of total disintegration. It is widely regarded, then and since, as one of the most skillful operational achievements of the entire war, studied afterward in military academies on both sides of the Cold War divide as a textbook example of mobile counteroffensive doctrine. And it cements Manstein's standing as the general whose judgment Hitler, however reluctantly and however often the two men clash over strategy, cannot entirely ignore. The clashes, however, grow more frequent and more consequential as the war turns decisively against Germany through 1943 and into 1944. Manstein's entire operational philosophy depends on flexibility, the willingness to trade space for the ability to concentrate force at the decisive moment, to withdraw from untenable positions before they become traps, and to keep mobile reserves free to respond to the true weight of an enemy offensive rather than fixing them in place defending ground that carries symbolic rather than strategic value. Hitler's instincts run in the opposite direction, shaped by memories of the German army's near collapse during the retreat from Moscow in the winter of 1941 and 1942, when he had personally overruled requests for withdrawal and later credited his own rigid stand-fast orders with preventing a total disaster, a formative experience that leaves him deeply and permanently suspicious of any general advocating for retreat, regardless of the tactical logic behind the request. The disputes between them recur with increasing bitterness through the retreat across Ukraine following the German defeat at Kursk in the summer of 1943, the largest tank battle in history, and one in which Manstein's own forces, attacking from the southern flank as part of the pincer against the Kursk salient, achieve tactical gains before the offensive is called off, a decision Manstein later argues was premature and cost Germany the chance to at least bloody Soviet reserves badly enough to slow the offensives that follow. In the retreat that follows through the second half of 1943, Manstein repeatedly requesting the freedom to conduct exactly the kind of elastic, mobile defense that had produced the Kharkov counterstroke, and Hitler repeatedly refusing to authorize withdrawals he considers politically unacceptable, insisting instead on rigid defensive positions that Manstein's own professional judgment increasingly regards as untenable given the forces actually available to hold them. By early 1944, with Soviet offensives continuing to push German forces back across southern Russia despite Manstein's persistent requests for greater operational freedom, and with Manstein having reportedly told Hitler directly, in one particularly tense meeting, that the army group's difficulties stem as much from headquarters interference as from Soviet strength, the relationship between the two men has deteriorated past the point of productive disagreement. Hitler relieves Manstein of command on March 30, 1944, replacing him with Field Marshal Walter Model, and Manstein retires to private life in Germany, never receiving another active command for the remainder of the war. It is only months after Manstein's dismissal that the aircraft his post-war reputation eventually connects him to begins reshaping the battlefield in a theater he has never commanded in. The P-47 Thunderbolt, originally conceived and built by Republic Aviation as a high-altitude escort fighter, proves in practice to be an unusually capable ground attack aircraft as well, a role that comes to define its combat legacy in the European theater more than its original escort mission ever does. Among the largest and heaviest single-engine fighters of the entire war, weighing nearly twice as much as some contemporary German fighters, the aircraft earns the nickname Jug among American pilots, short for Juggernaut, a name that captures both its bulky profile and the sheer physical resilience that becomes its defining characteristic in combat. Its air-cooled radial engine gives it a durability that liquid-cooled fighters like the P-51 cannot match, capable of absorbing significant battle damage from ground fire and still returning its pilots safely to base. Pilots return from missions with cylinders shot away, wings perforated by flak fragments, and canopies shattered, and still bring the aircraft home. Stories that circulate widely enough within 9th Air Force squadrons to become a foundational part of the type's reputation among the men flying it, a quality that makes squadron commanders considerably more willing to send P-47s down to low altitude against heavily defended ground targets than they are with more fragile aircraft. Armed with 850 caliber machine guns and capable of carrying bombs and rockets in addition to its formidable gun armament, the Thunderbolt becomes, through the summer of 1944, the primary weapon of 9th Air Force's tactical air squadrons operating in direct support of the ground campaign in France. Squadrons whose mission shifts. Once Allied forces break out of Normandy in late July, from supporting a slow, grinding advance through the hedgerows towards something considerably more decisive, hunting and destroying the German army's capacity to move at all. The shift becomes unmistakable during the Mortain counterattack in early August 1944, launched under the codename Operation Lüttich, on Hitler's direct order and against the advice of commanders on the ground, who consider it premature, given the forces available. When German armor launched westward, in a desperate attempt to cut Patton's supply corridor at Avranches, finds itself under near-constant attack from rocket-firing Typhoons and P-47s, operating with almost no effective Luftwaffe opposition to contest the skies above the battlefield. Pilots of the 9th Air Force's fighter groups, flying continuous armed reconnaissance sorties over the Mortain sector, once American ground observers on the surrounded Hill 314 begin radioing target coordinates for the advancing German columns below, credit the resulting attacks with breaking up German formations before they can concentrate for a coordinated assault, forcing tanks to disperse into whatever cover the terrain offers, rather than advancing in the massed columns the attack plan had called for. German tank crews, veterans of years of combat on multiple fronts, later describe an experience unlike anything they had previously faced. Armor that had proven itself capable of absorbing considerable ground fire, finding itself instead targeted from above by aircraft that could attack, break off, and return for another pass faster than any ground-based countermeasure could respond. The failure of the Mortain attack, driven as much by relentless air interdiction as by American ground resistance, becomes one of the clearest early demonstrations of what Allied air supremacy means for German offensive operations in the West. Not merely attrition of individual vehicles, though that attrition is severe, but the practical impossibility of concentrating and moving significant armored formations in daylight without accepting catastrophic losses before they can even reach contact with the enemy. The lesson repeats with even greater scale and horror only weeks later, as German 7th Army and elements of 5th Panzer Army attempt to escape the closing Falaise pocket through the narrow corridor around Trun and Chambois in the 3rd week of August. With the gap narrowing daily under pressure from American, British, Canadian, and Polish forces closing from multiple directions, Tens of thousands of German troops and thousands of vehicles are funneled onto a shrinking network of country roads with essentially no alternative routes available, creating exactly the kind of dense, slow-moving target that Allied fighter bombers are, by this point in the campaign, extensively practiced at exploiting. P-47s and Typhoons fly repeated sorties against the packed columns through daylight hours across several consecutive days, and while historians continue to debate the precise proportion of German losses in the pocket, attributable specifically to air attack as opposed to artillery, armor, and ground combat converging on the same shrinking space, the scale of destruction visible to Allied troops entering the area afterward, roads blocked for considerable distances by wrecked and burned-out vehicles, dead horses still in their harnesses beside overturned wagons, the wreckage in places dense enough that clearing crews require days to restore even limited traffic, leaves no doubt among commanders on either side that this represents one of the most complete tactical air power achievements of the entire European campaign. General Paul Hauser, commanding 7th Army through the final desperate days of the encirclement, is himself severely wounded attempting to lead elements of his own trapped forces out through the closing gap, an injury that leaves him unable to speak and forces him to communicate orders in writing during the critical final hours of the breakout attempt. A detail that later commentators cite as emblematic of just how completely command and control itself, not merely individual vehicles, breaks down under the combined weight of ground and air attack converging on the same narrow corridor. What these battles ultimately force upon the German army is not simply a series of costly defeats, but a fundamental change in how German forces of every size, from individual supply trucks to entire panzer divisions, are able to move at all for the remainder of the campaign in the West. Daylight movement of any significant formation becomes prohibitively dangerous across most of France, and, as the front moves closer to Germany, across the Low Countries and the Rhineland as well. Reconnaissance patrols and forward artillery observers on the American side learn to watch for the telltale signs of daytime German movement: dust clouds on dirt roads, sudden gaps in roadside foliage, the glint of metal beneath inadequate camouflage, and radio coordinates back to circling flights of P-47s already tasked with armed reconnaissance, rather than waiting for a specific target to be assigned from higher headquarters. A system that compresses the time between a German column being spotted and coming under attack to a matter of minutes in many cases. German units adapt by shifting the overwhelming majority of significant troop and supply movement to nighttime hours, accepting the reduced pace and coordination difficulty this creates in exchange for at least partial protection from the fighter bombers that own the daylight sky. Though night movement carries its own costs, convoys moving without headlights on unfamiliar roads suffer more accidents and take longer to reach their destinations, and the compressed hours of darkness during summer months in particular limit how much distance any single night's movement can actually cover. Camouflage discipline, always a component of German field doctrine, becomes considerably more rigorous and essential to survival rather than merely good practice, with vehicles dispersed and concealed under trees, in barns, and beneath camouflage netting during daylight hours, whenever possible, rather than staged openly for rapid onward movement. In a detail that connects directly to the broader logistics crisis German forces face throughout the war's final year, some German units increasingly turn back toward horse-drawn transport for certain supply functions, specifically because horses, dispersed and concealed more easily than motor vehicles, and requiring no vulnerable fuel supply chain that Allied aircraft can also target, prove in some circumstances less exposed to air attack than the mechanized transport that German doctrine had spent years trying to expand. The doctrinal consequence of this shift strikes directly at the operational philosophy Manstein had spent the war perfecting and advocating for. His entire concept of mobile, elastic defense, the backhand blow that had produced the Kharkov counterstroke, and that he had continued urging Hitler to authorize, even in his final weeks of command, depends fundamentally on the ability to move reserves quickly and concentrate them at a decisive point once an enemy offensive reveals its true weight and direction. It is a doctrine built for an operational environment in which movement itself, whatever risks it carries from artillery and ground-based countermeasures, remains fundamentally possible during daylight hours when commanders need it most. In the France of the summer and autumn of 1944, under skies effectively controlled by Allied fighter bombers operating with only sporadic Luftwaffe opposition, that basic precondition no longer holds. A commander attempting to execute exactly the kind of rapid concentration Manstein had used to such effect at Kharkov would find, in the west of 1944, that the reserves he needed to move could not reach the battlefield in time, or could not reach it intact, because the roads and rail lines connecting them to the point of decision had become killing grounds the moment the sun rose. It is a structural problem that Soviet tactical air power, formidable as it becomes by 1944, never quite replicates on the Eastern Front with the same totality. Meaning Manstein's own doctrine, whatever its theoretical validity, is tested against a Western air environment he personally never has to operate within. Manstein's post-war reflection on this dynamic, offered from the distance of a decade, and drawing on the broader historical record, rather than personal battlefield experience, identifies something his own career's central achievements depended upon, and that the war's final phase in the West systematically denies to every German commander who succeeds him in a Western command. It is, in its way, a professional soldier's recognition that the operational brilliance he had spent his career refining was itself contingent on conditions, a contested but not fully dominated sky, that no longer existed by the time his successors needed them most. Whether Manstein's own doctrine, transplanted intact into the France of August 1944, would have fared any better against Allied air supremacy than the more conventional defensive dispositions Model and other commanders actually employed, is a question that can never be tested, precisely because Manstein's dismissal in March removes him from any Western command before Allied air power reaches the intensity that defines the summer's fighting. What he offers instead, years later, is an assessment made possible only by not having been there, a strategist examining, with the clarity that comes from removal rather than immersion, exactly what changed about mobile warfare once one side lost, almost entirely, the ability to move its own forces without being seen and struck from above. On the road through the corridor of death in the third week of August 1944, the German soldiers trying to escape the closing pocket have no occasion to consider what any dismissed field marshal in retirement back in Germany might eventually write about their situation. They know only the immediate reality of a column that cannot move forward fast enough and cannot disperse into cover that does not exist along this stretch of open farmland, aircraft returning again and again through the daylight hours, with a persistence that makes every attempt to repair the road or clear a path forward another opportunity for the next pass to find a fresh target. Some survivors later recall throwing themselves into roadside ditches at the first sound of approaching engines, learning within hours to distinguish the sound of a Thunderbolts radial engine from a Typhoons inline engine well enough to guess, before the aircraft is even visible, roughly what kind of attack run to expect and where along the road it is most likely to begin. Drivers abandon vehicles that will not start or that block the road too completely to move, continuing on foot alongside men who have already lost their own transport, carrying what they can and leaving behind equipment that, only weeks earlier, had represented the mobility and firepower that German doctrine had built its entire reputation upon. By the time the survivors who make it through the gap regroup east of the Seine, the army reforming around them moves by a different logic than the one that had carried German forces from the Ardennes to the Channel 4 years earlier. A logic dictated less by operational doctrine than by the simple, brutal fact of which side controls the daylight sky, and what that control means for anything trying to move beneath it. What the story of the P-47's impact on German movement and Manstein's distant post-war reckoning with it ultimately illustrates is how completely the balance of tactical air power can rewrite the assumptions beneath even the most sophisticated ground doctrine ever developed. Manstein built a career and a reputation that endures among military historians to this day, on the premise that boldness, flexibility, and the willingness to move faster and more decisively than an opponent could produce victory, even against superior numbers. That premise had proven itself repeatedly on the Eastern Front, where Manstein commanded, where Soviet air power never achieved the same totality of daylight dominance that Allied fighter bombers establish over France by the summer of 1944. He never has to test his doctrine against the environment that ultimately disproves its universal applicability, dismissed from command weeks before the aircraft that would have posed that test begins hunting German columns across a theater he has already left behind. The commanders who succeed him in the West, Model, Rundstedt in his second tenure, and the officers beneath them attempting to execute mobile defense against an enemy that owns the daylight sky completely, inherit a doctrine built for a war that in the specific dimension of tactical air power no longer exists by the time they are asked to fight it. What Manstein leaves instead is a verdict rendered from a study in post-war Germany rather than a command post in wartime France. Accurate, by every measure historians have since applied to it, but earned entirely second-hand. A brilliant operational mind's honest acknowledgement of a battlefield truth he understood without ever having to survive it himself, and a reminder that even the most celebrated doctrine of maneuver warfare the war produced was never, in the end, a match for an enemy that could simply own the sky above it.